We thought we had left it behind. The shadows, the whispers, the fear. But some places don't let you go. They follow you. This is part one of a two-part investigation. A story about what happened when we came back from the dark. And what came back with us. Welcome to the Fear Archives. If you love stepping into the shadows with us, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. Now, let's begin. The van's headlights sliced through the thick mist, the pale beams swallowed by the darkness beyond. The hum of the engine and the crunch of tires on the cracked asphalt were the only sounds. The world outside was silent, the kind of silence that felt like it was listening. Inside the van, the air was heavy. Mike's grip tightened on the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. The usual post-investigation buzz was gone. No jokes, no recaps of eerie moments, no banter about potential views and subscribers. Mike, late 30s, calm under pressure but carrying the weight of responsibility as the leader of the group, a skeptic turned believer after years of paranormal investigations. Next to him, Sarah sat in the passenger seat, her knees drawn up slightly, her chin resting on her arms. She stared out the window at the dark blur of passing trees. Sarah, late 20s, an artist with a fascination for the supernatural. Quiet and introspective, but sensitive to the emotions of others. She had always seen patterns where others saw chaos. But tonight everything felt wrong, like a familiar song played out of tune. Mike glanced at her, sensing her unease. "You all right?" Sarah blinked slowly, as though she'd forgotten where she was. She turned her head just enough to meet his gaze. Her voice was thin. "I'm fine." But her eyes told another story. In the back, Tariq was hunched over his phone, his face bathed in the cold blue glow of the screen. His finger dragged across the timeline of the asylum footage, rewinding and replaying a specific moment over and over. Tariq, early 30s, tech-savvy and logical, the group's voice of reason. He often dismissed the supernatural as exaggerated stories, but something about the footage gnawed at him. He paused the video and squinted at the screen. There. A dark shape shifted at the edge of the frame. "Probably just bad lighting," he muttered, though he didn't believe it. Beside him, Layla rested her head against the window, the passing streetlights casting flickering shadows across her face. Her breath fogged the glass. Layla, late 20s, witty but private. She had joined the team after a personal tragedy, a death that left her chasing answers. She had always been the group's comic relief, easing tense moments with humor. But tonight, the weight of the asylum clung to her like a shadow. Her eyes fluttered open. She sat up suddenly, her heart racing, her voice cracked. "Wait, where's Alain?" The tension in the van shifted, tightening like a wire pulled taut. Mike frowned, glancing at her in the mirror. "What do you mean?" Layla pressed a hand to her forehead. I saw him by the gate when we left." Tariq looked up, adjusting his glasses. "Layla, Alain's right here." The others turned toward the back seat. Alain was slumped in the corner, arms crossed, his head resting against the window. Layla's eyes widened, her breathing quickened. "No," she whispered. "That isn't him." The van grew colder. Sarah's whisper broke the silence. "Stop the van." Mike's pulse quickened, but he pulled over. The van rolled to a stop on the gravel shoulder, the headlights cutting long beams into the forest. The skeletal trees stood in a line, their spindly limbs stretching upward like black veins. For a second, just a second, something shifted between the trees. A shadow. A flicker. Gone. The van pulled into the parking lot behind their apartment complex. The headlights washed over the cracked pavement and the faded graffiti on the walls. Mike killed the engine. Everyone sat for a moment in silence before stepping out into the cold night air. Alain yawned and rubbed his face as he climbed out last. He stretched, rolling his shoulders. "I'm fine," he muttered as he caught Layla's worried stare. "Just let it go, okay?" Layla didn't respond. She watched as Alain walked toward the entrance to his building. Her heart pounded in her chest as she noticed a flicker of movement. For just a moment, she thought she saw a second figure following behind him, taller, darker. She blinked. Gone. The asylum footage was paused on a wide shot of the hallway. Tarek rewound the clip again, leaning closer to the screen. His eyes were bloodshot, and his reflection flickered faintly in the monitor's glare. There, in the corner of the frame, a shadow. Small, barely noticeable. He pressed play. The shadow moved. Tariq's breath quickened. He scrubbed back again, his finger trembling slightly as he dragged the timeline back and forth. The shadow was closer now. His phone lit up beside him, making him jump. A message. "I'm watching you." There was no number. Tariq's throat went dry. He stared at the message, refusing to blink. The phone buzzed again. Another message. "Why don't you check the window?" The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Slowly, he turned toward the window. The curtains swayed gently, though the window was closed. He held his breath as he reached out and pulled the curtains aside. The street below was still, except for a figure standing beneath the street lamp. It was tall and impossibly thin. Its head was tilted back, its face shrouded in shadow as though staring at the sky. Tariq's pulse pounded in his ears. The street lamp flickered once, twice. The light went out. When the street lamp flickered back on, the figure was gone. Tariq stumbled backward, knocking his chair to the floor. He turned away from the window, heart racing. His phone vibrated again in his hand. A new message appeared on the screen. "Behind you." Tariq's breath came in shallow bursts. He squeezed his eyes shut before forcing himself to turn around. The room was empty, but the feeling of being watched never left. Layla sat on the edge of her bed, brushing her hair in slow, deliberate strokes. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the heater and the soft ticking of the clock on her nightstand. Her reflection watched her, but something felt wrong. She raised her hand, testing it. The reflection mimicked her, but with a delay. Her breath caught in her throat. Slowly, the reflection tilted its head, not in curiosity, but as though it was listening to something behind her. Layla's heart raced. She reached out to touch the mirror. The reflection smiled. Not a soft, reassuring smile, a grin that stretched too wide, showing teeth that were too sharp. Her pulse quickened. The mirror cracked with a soft pop, a thin fissure spreading outward like a spider's web. A soft whisper drifted from the crack, so faint it was almost inaudible. "We're still here." Layla stumbled back, her hand knocking over a small glass jar on the nightstand. It shattered against the floor. The bedside lamp flickered once, twice. Then the room was swallowed in darkness. The last thing Layla saw before the light went out was her reflection, still standing there, grinning, its eyes far too dark. Mike sat at his desk, scrubbing through the asylum footage. The room was dim, the only light coming from his laptop screen. The video flickered with static. The screen froze. Mike leaned closer, frowning. His reflection stared back at him from the dark monitor. Then it blinked. Mike's heart skipped a beat. He sat back, eyes wide. His own reflection had blinked, but he hadn't. The reflection tilted its head, not like someone curious, but like something hungry. The reflection's mouth moved, forming silent words. "Let me in." The screen flickered again and went black. A soft creak echoed through the room. Mike turned slowly toward the hallway door. It was ajar, swinging slightly as though something had passed through it. A cold breeze drifted into the room, carrying the scent of dust and damp wood. Mike stood and grabbed the edge of the door. His hands shook as he slammed it shut and turned the lock. The whisper came from behind the door, not loud but close. "You can't run." Mike paced the living room, running a hand through his hair. His apartment was cluttered with camera gear, tripods, notebooks, cases of recording equipment. Usually it felt like a second home. Tonight, it felt like a prison. Sarah sat curled on the couch, her knees drawn up to her chest. She hadn't touched the tea Mike had set on the table in front of her. Tariq was slumped in the armchair, his laptop resting on his knees. His hair was unkempt, and his shirt was wrinkled. Dark circles ringed his eyes. Layla stood by the window, hugging herself. She avoided looking at her reflection in the glass. The room was filled with the faint hum of the heater, but the cold still clung to the air. Mike stopped pacing. "We need to talk." Layla let out a short, humorless laugh. "No kidding." Tariq sighed, rubbing his temples. "I thought I was losing my mind, but it's real, isn't it?" Sarah nodded, her voice soft but steady. "It's real." Tariq leaned forward. "It watches me." Layla's voice cracked. "It smiled at me." Mike clenched his fists. "It's in my house." He took a breath, steadying himself. "We have to end this." Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide. "How?" Mike swallowed hard. "We have to go back to the asylum." The room fell silent. Layla's breathing quickened. "What if it doesn't let us leave?" Mike's jaw tightened. "Then at least we tried." Tariq glanced at each of them before nodding slowly. "Okay." Sarah let out a shaky breath. "I'm in." Layla hesitated, staring down at her hands. Then she nodded. "All right." Mike exhaled, relieved but anxious. "Tomorrow night, we finish this." The room seemed to darken, as though the shadows in the corners had grown. None of them spoke. They knew this wasn't the end. Some doors should never be reopened, but some things don't give you a choice. Next time on the Fear Archives, we return to where it all began, and what waits for us may not let us leave again. If you've made it this far, thank you for stepping into the dark with us. Like, subscribe, and comment below. What would you do if the shadows followed you home?